I am so excited to continue our series about how to teach different skills. Today, we are diving into strategies for WH questions. And I think we all know how fundamental WH questions for success in the classroom, literacy development, social interaction, all of the things. Before we dive into the strategies, I wanted to share a couple tidbits from the research. And I will share my citations in the show notes. Parnell et al. Talk about how students with language delays produce less appropriate and less accurate responses to questions. And those are two things that we want to consider as we're approaching intervention and strategies that we're using. So an appropriate response would be that we're responding to a who question with a who answer. So like, who went to the zoo? The girl did, and not responding with like a what or a why. If we say who went to the zoo because they wanted to, that would be an inappropriate answer because they're using the wrong question word. And it would also be inaccurate because it's the wrong response. But we want to look at, are they identifying the question word and responding? So if they say who went to the zoo and they say the girl, but it was really the penguin who went to the zoo, then that would be an appropriate response because they're identifying the who and giving a who answer, but it would be an inaccurate response because that's not the correct answer, but they are identifying the correct question word. So that's one thing we want to consider. Students with language delays often show appropriateness before accuracy. So we might see students start to give more appropriate answers before they become totally accurate. So that is something helpful to consider and something that we might look at in our data collection. I make skill packs for a lot of different skills, and I started this because I was working as a school-based SLP, managing a caseload in the triple digits, and I was not feeling my most confident, and I wanted to make sure that even if I was spread very thin, I was providing the best possible intervention for my students, and that I was doing it without breaking my neck. Enter the skill packs and a bunch of other things that I've made over the years. I dug through the research, and I started this process about 11 years ago when I started working and managing that massive caseload. I made these skill packs to help organize the practical strategies and give me access to materials right at my fingertips. I'm going to pull from that as a practical example of what this could look like, but the focus will be on the actual evidence-backed strategies that we can use. How I structure these packs are through assess, teach, practice. So we want to have tools to assess a skill. We want to make sure that we're appropriately teaching the skill. This is a step that I would often skip as a newer SLP. And then we want to give students the opportunity to practice. So we're going to start with the assess portion. We talked about appropriateness versus accuracy, which is important to think about all throughout intervention when working with WH questions. But we'll move through strategies for assessment and then teaching and practice. Strategy number one is to assess to find our starting point. We need to make sure that we're meeting students where we're at. I like to get a baseline assessment to help me determine what goal is even appropriate for the student, but then also where we need to start and what levels of support they need. If they're at 0% accuracy, my approach is going to look a lot different versus if they're at 50% accuracy. So I like to have a strong baseline assessment, and usually that's level to pinpoint exactly where we want to start with the goal. I also like to have a probe for the goal I end up writing, and I use that probe to assess the student's progress throughout intervention. We do want to find our starting point. We want to start with that baseline assessment. I go from simpler to more complex and look at the different question types because research shows us that some question types are more complex. They might struggle more with a certain question type. So there are responses to all of the question types, like who, what, when, where, why, how, and then I increase the complexity of that. So I might start with responding to questions about a simple picture. I might include general knowledge questions and comprehension questions about a passage. I can pull out my assessment packet and look at all of those different levels. And then wherever the student starts to struggle, I'll be able to identify their strengths. We can leverage that in intervention. Also, I want to find that sweet spot of where does it make sense to start intervention? Are answering questions about a picture Or are we moving all the way to responding to questions about a story? And there's different levels of complexity there. Having a strong baseline helps us identify what makes sense for that. The skill pack in SLP now includes that leveled assessment to help you do that really good baseline to identify where students need to start. We also have probes for all of the different goals that you might write for that ongoing intervention. That was our strategy 1, using a baseline assessment to figure out where to start. Then strategy 2 is explicitly teaching the question words using visuals. Swanson 2001 talks about explicit teaching. How we do that with WH questions is we select a question word to focus on, and we might have a visual to help the students understand what that word means. We might also have a quick student-friendly definition. So we might have a picture of an object and an action, a simple definition for a what question is a thing or an action. Then we would practice answering questions. So we have a number of different visuals inside the WH question skill pack. You can also do quick drawings and make your own little cards for the visuals for students. We have little cards for each question word with the icon and the quick student-friendly definition. We also have sheets that have examples of answers. The what page has the icons and the student-friendly definition, as well as examples of things like an apple, washing, stretching, clapping, all of those types of things. We have that for all of the different question words. Then we have a bunch of different ways to help you have that visual to help you teach it. And so you would introduce, like, today we are practicing what questions. This is what a what question is. And the strategy 3 is to scaffold using a hierarchy. So part of that we talked about already in strategy 1 in just using that assessment to determine where students are at. Are they able to answer questions about photos, general knowledge questions, or questions about a text, question about conversation? This is where teacher-parent report would come in, classroom observations, all of that good stuff. We would write the goal for the appropriate level, and then we have activities to practice those. So we have photo cards where you can practice who is in the picture, and then you would pair that with the visual. If you're practicing who today, you would have the little who card or the little who page. And you can have practice discrimination too, like maybe have the who and the what poster if they're already good at responding to what questions. That's how we can leverage their strength. You can have these picture cards and you can ask who is in the photo. And then you'll pop, okay, what word are you hearing? What question word is that? So first identifying the question word. Oh, we heard the who, so we're looking for a person. Then you look at the picture. Who's the person in this picture? They can say a boy. And then to leverage their strength and to practice that discrimination, you can say, okay, what's the boy doing? What kind of question was that? Is that a who or a what? And so you can point to the appropriate card and then they can respond, giving an appropriate and accurate response to that question. And so you could rinse and repeat for all of the different question types. And then you can move on from simple photos, and you can use the photos in the skill pack, any photos that you have in decks of cards, or you can look at pictures in books or ask questions about the immediate environment. There are so many ways to scaffold that depending on where the student is at in the hierarchy. Strategy 4, which we've touched on a little bit, is to teach one WH question at a time. Parnell et al. 1986, Eisenberg 2014 talk about focusing on one question type as a way to support mastery and reduce cognitive load. We can use the assessment to identify which question, like if they're really good at who and what questions, then we don't need to target them. We can leverage those as a strength. And then if they are struggling with when questions, for example, we would put our focus on when questions and just focus on that question type. And then as they master that, we can move on to more. Strategy is to embed WH questions in meaningful context. The 4 steps I've talked about have been very decontextualized. We're doing assessment using visuals and doing very structured practice to help teach that concept. Then we want to move a meaningful context. So we want to move away from these card decks and structured activities and move into books and classroom activities as quickly as possible. I could share a lot of references to the use of meaningful context for this skill. Dr. Ukrainitz's research emphasizes this. There's also a study by Justice et al. From 2002 about using shared storybook reading. Lots of evidence to support using this approach. The reason why we want to make sure that we jump into embedded practice as quickly as possible is that it facilitates generalization. I think that's the biggest thing. It doesn't matter if they can respond to the most complex WH questions in the speech room if they're not able to use that in the classroom. We want to think about where we ultimately want them to use the skill and give them the opportunity to practice that as quickly as possible. It would be like if I were a basketball coach and I only ever had my students do drills. If it's game time, they're really going to struggle. If they only did dribbling practice and never practice the coordination of all the things in a game. And so it's the same thing with all of the skills that we target, but it also option. Then our last strategy is to provide high repetition with varied practice. Repetition builds mastery, and the varied context support generalization. We do want to use the question cards and structured practice to build that repetition. Then we want to make sure, again, that we're moving into that embedded practice as quickly as possible, because that is critical for generalization. In terms of WH questions, the varied practices that we're not asking the same question over and over, we are asking, if we're doing a storybook, there's variability and varied practice built in. We're answering questions about different activities throughout the story unit. Last week, I did a podcast episode about how I used Apple Trouble to target all of the skills. That'll give you a lot of ideas for varied practice with WH questions, from doing the KWL chart to the book walk to the virtual field trip to the story. There's lots of varied practice built into a literacy-based therapy unit, and we'll leverage that. So those are our 6 strategies for W questions. So a quick recap. 1, we want to have a high-quality assessment to help us determine which level is most appropriate for students. And we'll use that to inform our goals and how we structure intervention. Strategy 2 is to explicitly teach the word meanings and to leverage visuals. Strategy 3 is to scaffold using a hierarchy based on the assessment results. We might start with questions about pictures and then move up to general knowledge and then about a passage. We want to teach one question at a time. Strategy 5 is to embed this practice in a meaningful context to facilitate generalization. Strategy 6 is to provide high repetition with varied practice. Those are our 6 strategies. Check out the show notes for the references and examples of what this looks like. If you want to access the WH questions unit with all the assessments, visuals, and structured practice in one nice download, it's totally no strings attached. You'll just enter your name and email, set up a password, you'll get logged in. You can go to the materials page, download the WH questions pack, and have the access to this awesome resource. Or you can check out some of our other skill packs and therapy plans and resources. I started creating these materials as a very overwhelmed SLP who still really wanted to serve her students well. These materials have been 11 years in the making. We're constantly updating and revamping them, and I hope that they make your life a little bit easier and make it easier to implement some of these strategies. So that's a wrap for today. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.